China didn't invade Africa. It didn't send tanks or drop bombs. It did something far more effective. It wrote checks. While the West was busy fighting wars in the Middle East, debating pronouns, and bailing out banks, Beijing was quietly buying an entire continent. Ports, railways, highways, power grids, mines, farmland. China now controls more African infrastructure than any Western nation combined. And the bill is coming due. Not for China, for Africa. Because when you can't pay back a loan from Beijing, you don't get a stern letter. You lose your port. You lose your airport. You lose your sovereignty. Debt trap diplomacy. This isn't aid. This isn't charity. This is the most sophisticated economic conquest in modern history. And today, we're going to follow every dollar, every contract, every handshake that built China's invisible empire across Africa. When you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. When you owe the bank 100 million, that's the bank's problem. Africa owes China far more than 100 million. And Beijing knows exactly what it's doing. The Belt and Road. In 2013, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative. The media called it a development plan. Economists called it ambitious, but strategists, they called it what it really was, the biggest power grab since the Marshall Plan. Except the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe and created allies. The Belt and Road Initiative builds infrastructure and creates debtors. There's a difference, a massive one. He who holds the purse strings holds the power. China committed over $1 trillion to this initiative. $1 trillion. That's more than the GDP of most African nations combined. And the terms, they weren't exactly transparent. Low interest rates that balloon. Grace periods that expire. Collateral clauses buried in fine print that would make a Wall Street lawyer blush. $1 trillion empire. The World Bank warned about it. The IMF raised concerns. Western governments issued statements, but none of them offered an alternative, and that's the part nobody wants to admit. China didn't fill a vacuum by accident. It filled it because nobody else showed up. But this was just the beginning of the strategy. Port by port. Let's talk about ports. Because ports aren't just places where ships dock, they're choke points, they're leverage, they're power. Leverage. China now has stakes in ports across Africa. Djibouti, Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Lamu, Bagamoyo, Kribai. These aren't random investments. Look at a map. These ports form a chain around the Indian Ocean and along Africa's Atlantic coast. Beijing's first overseas military base, Djibouti, right next to the port it financed. Coincidence? In 2017, Sri Lanka couldn't pay back its Chinese loans for the Hambantota port. What happened? China took a 99-year lease on the port. 99 years. That's not a loan restructuring. That's a takeover. When you cannot pay the debt, you hand over the keys. Kenya's Mombasa port nearly went the same way. Documents leaked showing that Kenya had used the port as collateral for Chinese railway loans. The Kenyan government denied it. The documents said otherwise. Ports equal power. If you're starting to see the pattern, hit like and subscribe to keep exposing what they hide. Because what comes next connects all the dots. The ports are just the visible part of this machine. Rails of control. Now let's follow the railways. Because if ports are the gateways, railways are the arteries. And China is building them everywhere. The Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway, 750 kilometers of track, $4 billion, built by Chinese companies, operated by Chinese technicians, funded by Chinese banks. Ethiopia couldn't afford a single payment on time. The Mombasa to Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, $3.8 billion, the most expensive infrastructure project in Kenyan history, built by China Road and Bridge Corporation. Kenya's debt to China tripled after that single project. The Lagos to Kano Railway in Nigeria, the Abuja Light Rail, the Bengla Railway rehabilitation in Angola, pattern after pattern after pattern. Here's what makes this genius. These railways don't just move people, they move resources, minerals, oil, agricultural products, and they move them from the interior of Africa straight to those Chinese-controlled ports we just talked about. The railways extract the wealth, and the ports ship it to Beijing. This is a supply chain built across an entire continent with someone else's money. Well, technically with loans that someone else has to repay, but the resources flow one direction. The debt trap. Let's be precise about numbers, because numbers don't lie, even when governments do. Africa's total debt to China is estimated at over $140 billion. $140 billion. Some estimates go higher, much higher, because many of these loans have confidentiality clauses, clauses that prevent the borrowing nation from even disclosing the terms. Think about that. A government borrows money on behalf of its people, and it's legally forbidden from telling those people the terms. Zambia was the first African country to default on its debt during the pandemic. Who was the biggest creditor? China, with over $6 billion in loans. Angola owes China over $25 billion. That's roughly a quarter of Angola's entire GDP. Secret loans, hidden terms. The Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria. The list grows every year, and here's the clause that should terrify every African citizen. Many of these agreements include what's called a sovereign immunity waiver. The borrowing country waives its right to protect its own assets from seizure. Read that again. A nation signs away its right to protect its own assets. There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword. The other is by debt. And the debt is only part of the equation. Resource grab. Follow the money and you'll find the motive. But follow the resources and you'll find the real strategy. Africa sits on 30% of the world's mineral reserves. Cobalt, lithium, coltan, copper, uranium, gold, diamonds, rare earth elements. The building blocks of every smartphone, every electric car, every missile system on the planet. Whoever controls Africa's minerals controls the future of technology. China understood this 20 years ago. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 70% of the world's cobalt. Chinese companies now control 15 of the 19 cobalt mines in the DRC. 15 out of 19. In Guinea, China secured access to the Simandou iron ore deposit, the largest untapped iron ore reserve on Earth. In Zimbabwe, Chinese companies have been granted lithium mining rights across the country. Lithium, the metal that powers every electric vehicle battery, every laptop, every phone. Cobalt, lithium, control. The West talks about green energy transitions. China is quietly locking up the raw materials needed to make that transition happen. While European and American companies debate ESG policies and carbon credits, Chinese firms are signing contracts. But the resource extraction tells only half the story. Soft power play. Military bases and mines are hard power. But China plays the soft game too, and it plays it brilliantly. Confucius Institutes across Africa, over 60 of them, teaching Mandarin, teaching Chinese culture, shaping how a generation of Africans sees China. Control the narrative, and you control the perception. Star Times, a Chinese digital television company. It provides affordable satellite TV to over 30 African countries. What do those channels broadcast? Chinese news, Chinese documentaries, Chinese perspectives on world events. Media shapes minds. China built the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. A $200 million gift. A gift, free of charge. Except in 2018, French newspaper Le Monde reported that the building's servers had been sending data back to Shanghai every night for 5 years. Every confidential conversation, every strategic document, copied to Beijing. The African Union denied it. China denied it. But the servers were replaced. When someone builds your house, they know where every door is. Scholarships for African students to study in China now outnumber those offered by the US and UK combined. These students return home fluent in Mandarin, understanding Chinese business culture, and predisposed to Chinese partnerships. This is empire building without firing a shot. Western failure. Now here's the uncomfortable part, the part that the West doesn't want to hear. China didn't create a vacuum in Africa. The West did. For 60 years, Western aid to Africa followed the same pattern. Give money, attach conditions, demand democratic reforms, lecture about human rights, then watch as the money disappeared into corruption with zero accountability. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank imposed structural adjustment programs that devastated African economies in the 1980s and 90s. Privatize everything. Cut social spending. Open markets to foreign competition before local industries could compete. The results were catastrophic. And Africans remember. Betrayal. Then China showed up with a different offer. No political conditions, no lectures about governance. Just business. You need a road, we'll build it. You need a port, we'll finance it. You need a stadium. Done. The terms might be predatory, the debt might be unsustainable, but at least something got built. Aid versus results. Africa chose visible infrastructure over invisible conditions. And honestly, can you blame them? But this choice comes with a price that's only now becoming clear. The land question. We've covered ports, railways, mines, and media, but there's one resource China is acquiring that most people overlook entirely. Land. Agricultural land. China has 1.4 billion people to feed, and it's running out of arable land. Pollution, urbanization, and desertification are shrinking Chinese farmland every year. So where does it turn? Africa, which has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Chinese companies and state-backed entities have leased or purchased millions of hectares across the continent. Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Ethiopia. Food security strategy. In some cases, local communities were displaced. Farmers who had worked the land for generations suddenly found themselves tenants on their own soil, or worse, landless. The Mozambique deal alone involved 300,000 hectares. That's larger than Luxembourg. An entire country's worth of farmland, signed away in a single agreement. When a foreign power controls your food supply, it controls your future. China isn't just securing today's resources, it's securing tomorrow's food supply. And in a world heading toward climate crisis, that might be the most strategic play of all. But even this isn't the full picture. Digital chains. There's one more dimension to this that might be the most dangerous of all. Technology. Huawei has built 70% of Africa's 4G networks. 70%. 70%. ZTE handles much of the rest. Chinese companies built the undersea cables connecting Africa to the global internet. They installed the surveillance cameras in cities from Nairobi to Lagos. They provided the facial recognition systems, the smart city platforms, the data centers. China didn't just build Africa's roads, it built its digital backbone. In Uganda, Huawei technicians reportedly helped the government hack into the phones of opposition leader Bobi Wine. In Zambia, Chinese technicians allegedly assisted in monitoring social media critics of the government. In Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, the pattern repeats. Data equals power. Here's why this matters more than ports or railways. Physical infrastructure can be nationalized. Debt can be renegotiated. But once your entire digital ecosystem runs on Chinese technology, you can't just switch it off. You're locked in. In the age of information, whoever controls the data controls the world. Every communication, every transaction, every movement, running through systems built by a foreign power. And that brings us to the question nobody wants to answer. What comes next? So where does this end? Let's project forward. Africa's population will double by 2050. 2.5 billion people, the youngest continent on Earth, the fastest urbanizing, the most resource-rich. And right now, China has first position on virtually every major infrastructure system, resource contract, and technology platform across the continent. The nation that controls Africa's growth controls the 21st century. Some African leaders are waking up. Tanzania renegotiated its Bagamoyo port deal. Sierra Leone cancelled a Chinese-funded airport project. Kenya is pushing back on railway debt terms, but for every country pushing back, 3 more are signing new agreements, because the alternative is nothing. No investment, no infrastructure, no growth. Resist or submit. The West offers speeches. China offers concrete, and concrete wins elections. The scramble for Africa never ended, it just changed hands. In the 19th century, European powers carved Africa up at the Berlin Conference. No African leader was invited. Today, the carving is done with loan agreements instead of maps, with debt instead of armies, with fiber optic cables instead of telegraph wires. Different century, same extraction, different tools, same result. The question isn't whether China is colonizing Africa. The question is whether Africa can leverage this relationship before the leverage runs out. Here's what I want you to take away from everything we've covered. This isn't about hating China. China is doing what every great power has always done. It's pursuing its interests with ruthless efficiency. The real question is why the rest of the world let it happen. Why did the West spend trillions on wars that achieved nothing, while China spent trillions on infrastructure that achieved everything? Why did international institutions fail Africa so completely that Chinese loans looked like the better option? And why does nobody talk about the fact that 54 African nations are being drawn into a debt web that may define their sovereignty for the next century? Follow the money, always. The pattern is always the same. Power doesn't announce itself. It builds roads, it lays cables, it signs contracts, and by the time you notice, it's already too late to renegotiate. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. If you made it this far, comment Debt Empire if you see the pattern now, because this story is far from over, and someone needs to be paying attention. Every government lies. The question is, what are they lying about? The truth is out there. You just have to follow the money. Subscribe if you want to keep digging.